So tonight I want to talk about psychoanalysis as an evolutionary theory. Freud was born in 1853, 3 years before Darwin published Origin of Species, and of course Freud grew up under the aegis of Darwinism. His teachers, von Brucke, who belonged to the so-called Helmholtz school of physicalistic physiology. These were passionate Darwinists, man is an animal. And Freud absorbed from Darwin the idea of development through discrete evolutionary stages. All of this, of course, is to be radically distinguished from so-called social Darwinism, those essentially reactionary, ethnocentric, and racist social theorists who took Darwin's idea of natural selection, survival of the fittest, in order to create this essentially racist ideology whereby certain peoples were considered primitive and Western white civilization was seen as the pinnacle of the evolutionary process. And of course, to try to exploit Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest in order to provide a spurious justification of competitive capitalism and rugged individualism. This, of course, was already a radical distortion of Darwin's ideas. And while it's true that Freud may have been infected by this kind of thinking to some degree, this was not at all the main thrust of his own thinking. What we're talking about here is not the idea of survival of the fittest, but we're talking about the idea of biological development, in Darwin's case, through discrete stages, much as we can trace the stages and phases of the development of the fetus as it goes through various stages towards full term and birth. Freud, of course, took this idea of epigenetic development through distinct phases and stages and developed it on the psychological rather than the biological plane. And as we know, he gave us the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic Oedipal stage, the latency stage, and the genital stage. So this is a stage theory, or an epigenetic theory, of psychological development, somewhat analogous to the stages of biological development: unicellular organisms, multicellular, invertebrates, vertebrates, mammals, primates, and then man, Homo sapiens. Erickson, of course, took Freud's stage theory of development, his theory of epigenesis, and expanded it by adding 3 more stages: youth, middle age, and the senior years. And then Erickson and his wife Joan added a 4th stage, making 9 stages. They had worked for many years with the 8 stages of man, but now they add a 9th stage. In the earlier model, the 8 stages, these are all about evolution. The 9th stage is about devolution. We learn to walk. Well, we learn to control our urination and we acquire bowel training, and then we learn to walk, and then we move through other stages, acquiring a capacity for intimacy with others, and so on. In the ninth stage, the stage of devolution, we essentially move backwards. We become less capable of achieving intimacy, because in old age those with whom we were intimate may often die, and we are increasingly alone, especially in Western civilization, where we don't have the extended family. As we continue to devolve, we become less autonomous, less able to look after ourselves. We may wind up in a wheelchair and be unable to walk, and of course ultimately we may wind up in diapers on the way towards death. So this is an evolutionary theory, and the Ericksons add the idea of devolution in extreme old age. Okay. Sociologists, whereas Freud applies epigenetic theory to psychological development, some sociologists applied it to social development. This was very difficult for sociologists like Talcott Parsons, Robert Bellah, my friend Eli Sagan. This was difficult for them to do, because social evolutionary theory had gotten such a bad name from the social Darwinists' exploitation of this kind of thinking to celebrate white Western people as somehow the pinnacle of development. And so there was a lot of resistance when Talcott Parsons began to speak about stages of social evolution, from hunter-gatherer societies organized by kinship to what Eli Sagan called complex societies, where there are kingships, as in Tahiti and Uganda, Hawaii, complex societies organized under a king. And then we come to the great ancient agricultural civilizations of Sumeria and Greece and Rome, and then we move on to monarchical societies, and then finally to societies that are increasingly democratic. A good case could be made that just as the Ericksons recognized devolution as well as evolution, we could certainly make the case that something like social devolution seems to be happening around the world as democracies are increasingly threatened by authoritarian regimes, new kinds of rulers who seek to be absolute rulers, the rise of fascism of one kind or another, which is threatening the democracies in many parts of the world today. Okay, so I argue that psychoanalysis itself, therefore, is a type of evolutionary theory, and I think certainly Freud, certainly Erickson, and I would add Wilfred Bion, all conceive of the evolutionary process in psychology as an evolution towards truth. Freud was interested in the development of the reality principle and the growth of the ego. The ego's function is reality testing, the growing ability to differentiate between facts and fantasies, to discriminate between wishful illusions and accurate perception of what's real, the surrender of wishful illusions and fearful illusions in favor of enhanced reality testing. Freud saw science as the reality principle in operation, trying to distinguish truth from error, reality from fiction, and from illusion and outright delusion. So Freud is seeing the mind as a development towards truth. Certainly Wilfred Bion sees it that way. The mind, in fact, is the human mind for Bion needs truth the way a plant needs water. A properly developing mind is increasingly acquiring the capacity to move closer and closer to an ultimately incompletely knowable truth, which he symbolizes as O. He's far from an intellectual nihilist in saying that O is incompletely knowable. He does not at all mean to deny that progress can be made toward knowing it more and more adequately, more and more accurately. This requires the complexification of the mind, the ability of the mind to link, and I would also say distinguish, to link and distinguish, and in these ways to achieve greater integration, more and more complex ways of understanding and drawing closer to what is an ultimately only incompletely knowable O, or truth. But just as the healthy mind seeks to evolve towards truth, so the unhealthy mind seeks prematurely to devolve away from truth, because sometimes truth is found to be unbearable. People differ in their capacity to bear truth. The healthy mind is able to bear more and more truth. The unhealthy mind can't bear it, and so instead of evolving towards it, begins to devolve away from it. It withdraws, it regresses, and it avoids. Bion's symbol for knowledge is K. The mind can move towards K, but it can also opt for minus K, a retreat from truth into illusion or delusion, or various forms of distraction from truths, from the march toward truths that are found unbearable. So in this way, psychoanalysis is an evolutionary theory. What then is the psychoanalyst? He or she is someone who seeks to assist the patient in resuming their development towards truth. The patient may have become fixated at a particular phase of their evolution, and they've not been able to move on, or they may have moved on and then they have regressed, they have fallen back. They seek an analyst. The analyst tries to help them get the process, the evolutionary process, going again. So just as an individual may become fixated or regress, I think a society, to move back to social evolutionary thinking, a society may become fixated or regress. And I would say that we are in a major worldwide phase of regression. Societies which had managed up until some point in the 1950s or 60s had managed to evolve in the direction of greater and greater democracy and equality. Racism certainly had not been eliminated, but the extension of democratic rights to women, to black people in the United States, things were moving progressively until Lyndon Baines Johnson's war on poverty and his celebration of the good society came to an end in the face of imperialist adventures conducted by the military-industrial complex in the U.S., put an end to that, and then along came Ronald Reagan with his ideology of free market economics, a kind of free market fundamentalism, essentially a religion. Once upon a time, people thought that occasionally it was God's invisible hand who affected human affairs, but in free market economic ideology, the invisible hand is that of the free market. That is the God concept there. It didn't work. We had the evolution of a society in which more and more wealth is transferred from the poor to the rich rather than the other way around. Democratic rights attempts are made to restrict voting, to make voting more difficult in certain areas and for certain people. We have this rise of authoritarianism, and we have a society which, instead of evolving towards truth, is evolving away from it, the so-called post-truth society, in which there are always, quotes, alternative facts. We have philosophers like Michel Foucault, for example, who make truth virtually entirely a construction and a highly relative construction. What constitutes truth on this side of the mountains is not considered truth on the other side of the mountains, and there's no way really of discriminating which of these visions of truth is correct and which is incorrect. This is the slide into extreme social constructivism and extreme cultural relativism. So all of this is a regression on the social level. So we need something like psychosocial therapists to help reverse this regressive trend in society and to get societies to pull out of this regression and return to the healthy evolution towards truth. Of course, in all of this emphasis on truth, we see reflected Bion's commitment to rationalism, a commitment he shared with Freud, and in an earlier video I argued that William Golding had a deeper insight than did Bion. In Lord of the Flies, Golding sees Ralph and Piggy as the rationalist leaders who are trying to save the boys by keeping the signal fires burning and knowing how to make fire and knowing not to eat certain berries and so on. All of this is a celebration of reason. But there is a third leader that Golding recognizes, and that is Simon, who stands for the humane values of caring, caritas. He cares for the dying captain. He cares for the creatures of the forest. He's essentially a Jesus figure. He comes to tell the boys the good news, to ease their paranoia that there's not a monster. The myth of the monster had been spread by Jack. There is no monster. It was simply the dying captain's parachute blowing in the wind. But before he can tell them the good news, he, of course, is killed, crucified, as it were, by Jack's crazed horde. So in addition to the rational leader, Golding recognizes a social-emotional leader, a leader who brings the values of the heart in addition to those of the head, and Bion rather misses that. So regression then is a regression not just from truth, not just from reason towards unreason, not just from truth towards lies. It is a regression from caritas, caring and kindness, towards either indifference to the needs of others or outright rejection of their needs. And so the regression we're currently undergoing is not just a regression of reason, it's a regression away from caring, from caritas, essentially from love, towards indifference, narcissism, and hate.